So now let's move on to the second presentation. Our speaker is Simon Jensen. Please be noticed that he's speaking from Germany, and that's now, I don't know, 3 o'clock in the morning. So thank you so much, Simon. The floor is yours, please.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, first of all, I have to apologize that I couldn't participate more in this conference, but it's indeed pretty early, 3:45 in the morning now. I hope you can see my slides, and I will just simply jump into the paper. The paper is entitled Future Technology Hubs or Backwater, Lessons on Structural Change from Germany's Coal Regions. It's joint work with Wolfgang Keller from Colorado, Hale Utar from Grinnell, and Ehsan Vallizadeh from the IAB. And it's pretty much work in progress, so I'm pretty happy for a lot of comments, critique, suggestions, and so forth. So what was the idea that kind of motivated us to look into this? Now, after the Second World War, the Germany experienced like a period of extreme economic growth and prosperity, which was called the economic miracle, or the Wirtschaftswunder. And one of the backbones for this economic growth was the coal industry and the connected steel industry, coal mining industry. And on one hand, it provided a lot of energy for the industrial growth, for manufacturing, production of steel, and so forth. On the other hand, it created thousands of jobs especially for medium and low-skilled workers in the coal mining areas. However, throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it became largely inefficient to produce or mine for coal in Germany, simply because the carbon layers are so deep below the surface that it became ever more costly to get to them. And here you see, for instance, coal prices from the Ruhr area, which is kind of the main coal mining area in Germany. This is the orange line, and you also see the import prices. And as you can see already in 1984, the coal prices for German coal are more than double the price for imported coal from countries such as Russia, Australia, and then later from China. But despite this kind of big gap in the domestic and import coal prices, German policymakers decided to heavily subsidize the coal industry to prolong its living. And here you see kind of the average subsidies per year in Germany between 1970 and 2017. And what you see is around the 90s in particular, there were more than 12 billion euros going into the coal mining industry. So it was one of the most subsidized industries in Germany per capita, at least. And so they try to keep the coal mining industry alive, largely by subsidizing the domestic coal, by paying the difference between the domestic coal price and the foreign coal price. But there were also subsidies for improvement of technology and other subsidies as well for retirement funds and so forth. And of course, policymakers did that to kind of win election, to stay independent of foreign imports. In particular, after the first two oil shocks, they kind of decided to subsidize the coal mining industry in Germany quite heavily, but also because they expected agglomeration spillovers that might push the economic development of these disadvantaged regions and avoid social hardship for the people who were working and living there. And therefore, we wanted to understand how these coal mining regions adjusted to coal mine closures over a period of 4 decades, right? We wanted to understand how, like, these regions changed when this kind of coal mines that were heavily subsidized and provided a lot of labor demand were vanishing, and we wanted to understand how these regions changed from like the subsidized resource-based growth towards a kind of a knowledge-based economy. And we wanted to understand which determinants are there that determine whether this transition was successful or unsuccessful. And by doing so, we essentially relate to two types of literature. The first one is on agglomeration spillovers, such as, for instance, Hale or Greenstone, Hornbeck-Moretti, or Gutman, et al., who use kind of plant openings and closings, large plant openings and closings, or nationwide trade shocks, and analyze these agglomeration spillovers on local economy. And in our paper, we kind of use a single shock out of a non-manufacturing subsidized industry that diffuses into the entire local economy. The other literature that we look or relate to is the literature on the resource-based growth and regional economies that largely looks on the coal bust and boom, or on fracking in the US. And examples are here: Alcott and Keniston, Fryer, Michaels, or Black, McKinnish, and Sanders. And our advantage in this paper is that we can exploit like shocks, say, to the coal industry over a large amount of years, over 4 decades, and can analyze how the effects differ at different points in time. So why German coal mining? No, first of all, as I said, we have substantial variation across space, but in particular across time, because the coal mine closures went on from like the early 70s until today. And these closures had a substantial impact on the local labor market because these coal mines are really large entities employing a lot of workers. And also the closures are largely external. They're anticipated and not entirely in this sense like an exogenous shock that nobody was anticipating, but they're external in a sense because they depend on the availability of coal. So you can't mine for coal if there's no coal left, and therefore policymakers kind of, or their scope to mingle with prolonging single mines is kind of limited by the presence of coal in some sense. Before I get to the results, I would like to talk a bit about the nature of mine closures in Germany. And here, what you see here is kind of a map of the districts of Germany. And you see the last closing of mines. Earlier closings are green and later closings are red. And you see there's spatial variation, but in particular, there's time variation because in almost every year you have some kind of closure in this in one of those regions. And we have here the large coal mining areas, which is the Ruhr area and the Saar area. And this year is East Germany. We exclude this because we don't have data for East Germany before the fall of the Iron Curtain. But still, you have quite some spatial variation that we can exploit here. And as I said, the impact was quite severe on these areas, because what we have here is the relative and the absolute, so the relative employment here on the left and the absolute employment on the right in a district, in a coal mining area that are miners, coal miners. And like roughly 10 to 5 years before the closure of the last mine was in the average district, it's roughly between 4 and 5% of the entire employment on average in those districts were miners. So this is for just one occupation. That's a really large share of this labor force. And this dropped to less than 1% in response to the last closure within a district on average. Or if you want to look at this in absolute terms, it dropped from approximately 4,500 towards less than 1,000. Now you may ask, why isn't it that zero after the closure? Now the thing is that these coal mines leave a a strong mark on the nature on the ground in those regions, right? Because the entire surface is filled up with holes, and there's a lot of problems with eruptions in those regions. For instance, the city of Ehsan declines every year little by little because of that coal mining industry that have been under that city. So there have to be workers kind of maintain that. For instance, these mines are flooded with water all the time to prevent those eruptions. There's engineers working, there's firefighters, there's medical personnel that is still working there. And so to speak, in our data, this is still recorded as people in the mining industry, because essentially they are partly employed by the ERG, which is the company who organizes or where all mines belong to in Germany. So that's why it does not drop entirely to zero after the closure of the last mine. I painted a picture here to kind of visualize how the mining closures work in Germany. So in Germany, we have a south-north gradient of the carbon layers. And the carbon layers are closer to the surface in the south than they are in the north. And this means, of course, that coal mining started earlier in the south because it was easier to get there. I mean, all mines in Germany started a long time ago, before the Second World War. So the period that we look at now, we don't have opening of mines, we only have closures of mines. But the depth of the carbon induces that the mines in the south close earlier than those in the north, right? Because the coal here will be exhausted earlier on, and the mining operation will then be transferred further to the north. And there's also another other specific situation in the German coal mining, that at least for the period that we look at, all coal mines belong to just one single company. So what they can do is they can kind of move all the workers from one mine to the next and so forth. And that's kind of what they do. And you see that the mine closures wander towards the north. When you look at 1980 here, you see that you still have a lot of mines in the south. In 1995, it's already less mines, and it's wandering towards the north, as I said, because the carbon layers in the north are not yet exhausted, because they are much deeper than those in the south. And here's also a picture of the carbon layers in the Ruhr area, where the dark blue are closer to the surface, the dark green are deeper, and you also see this north-south gradient. By the way, here, for instance, the carbon layers are very, very deep, but in this area, for instance, there were no mines ever, because it's super hard to get to that point. You probably need a lot of technology. Actually, it becomes very difficult for regions that are much deeper than 1,000 meters below the sea level. And what happens to the miners, and when such a mine closes, that is important to better later on understand the spillovers to the other region. And unfortunately, I only have individual data since a couple of days, so that I can really look at where they move and stuff. So I did these figures yesterday, essentially. But what's interesting is that here what you see is the cumulative share of mining workers. This is essentially cohort analysis. So relative to the population of miners in a district in the third year before the last closure, right? This is a cumulative share of mining workers who leaves the labor market, either for early retirement. They might also become self-employed. We cannot see that, but I think that's not a big issue. Most of them will be retirement or early retirement, and you see the strong increase of miners who retire early. And the retirement funds for miners are very generous in Germany. They can retire with only 40 years old, and they can retire without losses in their benefits. So a lot of miners retire in response to these closures. And then when we look at the cumulative share of mining workers who move to other districts in response to the closure of mines, we also see that it's almost between 50 and 60% of those miners who move to another district to work there. By the way, if there are questions, I am not quite sure whether I see them right now, but maybe someone might interrupt me.
Simon?
Yeah?
Sorry to interrupt you at 3:50 in the morning, but the figure does seem to suggest that there are some anticipation effects, right? That the speed of average mining workers leave to move to another district picks up just prior to the last closure. Is that something that's going to be an issue for you?
It depends. So as I said, these closures are external in some sense, but they are completely anticipated, of course, because I mean, if we can see that they will close in response to this carbon debt, everybody can see that. And of course, all these mines belong to one company. So what they do is they start shuffling workers around even before the mines finally close. And part of it will be anticipation effects. Part of it is also here, these figures, I did that to kind of be more able to display, to make it easier to look at this. But in some districts, there's more than one mine. Part of this is also that there was another mine closure before the closure of the last mine. But yeah, definitely, they anticipate this and they kind of try to move workers around. That's for sure. And if we look at those movers in more detail and look where they're moving, the largest share of those people actually moves to yet another mine and they stay miners until they retire early. So there's really like this shuffling of workers from one mine to the next going on here. Yeah, that's definitely an issue that we have to look closer into it, but we only have the individual level data since a couple of days so that we can look at it now.
Samuel, I have a question about the potential subsidies. So in one of the earlier figures, you showed us that there is a kind of growing gap between, say, domestic price and the international price, right? Mm-hmm. So that suggests subsidy. I'm wondering how the subsidy was implemented. So it's a kind of lump sum, or it's a unit based, or so I think it's related to how those companies were deciding what to do with these workers.
Yeah, so there's different types of subsidies, many different types, and the largest share of the subsidies was a so-called coal penny, which said that if you buy coal from a domestic mine, you get it for the import price, essentially. And this led to no imports of coal in Germany from other countries, essentially. That was the way it worked. And so there's these import prices that I showed here are actually fictive import prices that I mean, it's a bit funny because they were calculated by the mining companies itself, by the AG, and there was also some complaints whether these are actually really true or whether they do that to increase the subsidies and stuff like this. But that was the largest part of the subsidy. So if like a metal or steel company would buy coal from a German coal mine, it would get the coal for the import price, and the rest was paid off by the coal penny, so to speak. In addition, there were other subsidies, such as subsidies for technological improvements. There were subsidies for all these retirement of the workers, and there were also subsidies to refurbish the nature and stuff like this after the coal mines have left. But the largest share was this coal penny, so to speak.
Got it. Thank you.
Simon?
Yes.
There's something that I think I am confused. You say that the North and South mines are were in coexistence, but because of the market condition, this company have to close mines. But without the subsidies and so on, normally when you feel that because of competition, you're going to close the costly mines first. So wouldn't you close the North first?
Yeah, the problem is that the South was exhausted, so there was no coal left. So that was the reason why you have this North-South gradient, because these South mines were so old and the coal was exhausted. It's kind of like you would see in this picture here. If you go down here and you go further to the north, then at a certain point it becomes more efficient to enter from northern mine into this coal layer, so to speak. And this is why you see the closing in the south first. Okay, thanks a lot. So if you look at the unemployment rate relative to the population 3 years before the closure, you kind of see a bit of a dip in unemployment that is going on here. It's increasing a bit and then decreasing after the closure of the last mine again, but it's really not substantial. So unemployment for the miners themselves was not kind of a very big issue because they were taken care of, right? And to summarize, so to speak, the nature of these closures, first of all, they are external in some sense because they depend on the carbon layer, but they are anticipated, and we have to kind of admit this. This is not an external random shock, right? People know in advance what's going on. Then it's also no labor supply shock of many people entering the labor market, putting pressure on local wages, because, I mean, these miners are moved around. Many of them retire early, many withdraw from the market entirely. So it's rather a shock to input-output linkages. It's a shock to the purchasing power, because if you take 5,000 miners away and move them to a different place, that might put pressure or change the purchasing power of the inhabitants there. And it's, of course, a shock to labor demand, right, rather than to labor supply in some sense. Okay, so what do we do so far? So what we did is we matched a couple of data sets here. The first one is a data set that has information about all establishments in Germany, which covers 2.7 million establishments and 25 million jobs per year. And we merged this data with geocoded information for all mines that contains information on when they opened and when they closed. As I said, there were no mines opening throughout the period that we look at, but we can see the closures definitely. Then we also wanted to understand changes in the innovative power of these regions. So we merged this data with Padstat data about patents and also with universities. I will not speak too much about both of these later things here, but we are still working on this part of the paper. So overall, we have a panel structure that allows us to control for unobservable local labor market characteristics. And we look at these local shocks and forms of the closing mines. We do so by using two different approaches. The first one is a simple event type study thing, where D indicates the last mine closure in a region. And like an event study, you follow that mine closure before and after the last closure. We also have actually a version of this in the paper where we look at multiple closures, do a similar approach for multiple closures. The dependent variable are maybe the employment outside the mining industry, employment in specific industry outside the mining industry. It might be patents and so forth. And then we have state by year fixed effects, local labor market fixed effects, either municipality fixed effects or district fixed effects. We look at different levels here. And in essence, in our our broadest, boldest, so to speak, approach, we just use all former West German districts as controls, but we also have kind of a matched kind of approach where we try to find regions that are similar to the treated regions, but doesn't really change all that much, I have to say. I think it's in the paper. I will not show the matched thing today because it really doesn't change all that much. Then we use an approach that is a bit coarser, where the dependent variable is again the same local labor market characteristics as a function of the number of mine closures within a district or in a municipality. If you go on the district level, we have often more than one mine closure. If you go on the municipality level, it's very few municipalities have more than one mine actually. And then we have state by year fixed effects, and again, local labor market effects, either municipality or district fixed effects. So it's a very simple approach, so to speak. The first thing that we do is that we look on the effect on the employment outside the mining industry. And what you see here is, first of all, the parallel trends look quite decent, I would say, but then you see this drop by roughly 5%, which is very persistent. And of course, I know that these closures are not really random, unexpected shocks, and policymakers did a lot to kind of buffer the negative effects on the local economy. But despite all that, we see this, I would say, pretty huge effect on the local economy on average that is also very persistent. And there's a lot of heterogeneity in this effect. First of all, we have input-output linkages to like the usual suspects, I would say. So especially to the manufacturing industry that it uses a lot of energy from the coal industry and the iron and steel energy. So you have to think about these kind of the interplay between iron and steel and coal mining. Often these iron and steel producers were directly next to a coal mine, and the refined coal product would go from the conveyor belt out of the mine into the steel plant, where it would be used for steel and iron production. So this is not very surprising. But then we also have a lot of the demand linkages in the construction sector. We find these negative effects in the service and retail sector. So it's really like, I mean, there's a lot of workers going away from that region, and this will affect kind of the local market, the retail market, service, construction, and so forth. And when you look on average on the educational level of these workers, you see that most of the spillover, this is all spillover effect, so that's always employment outside mining, right? When you look at this, the workers who are hit hardest are medium skilled workers. This is also the largest population in Germany, so 60% of all German employees have a vocational degree. Now it's only 40 or 50%, but in the time that we are looking at, it's the largest population, but they're most affected. Also not too surprisingly, because they work in the manufacturing, they work in the iron metal industry, they work in retail, and all the things where we saw these effects. We see less of an effect for high skilled workers, and we see no effect for low skilled workers. I didn't put that up here because then the figure would be kind of messy.
Simon, clarifying question.
Yes.
Do you have the data? Do you have the data about the age structure of each closed firms?
Yes. So you mean the age structure of the workforce or the age of the firm?
No, I mean age of the workforce.
Yes, I have that. Yes.
And there must be some variation there, and that's got to have different employment spillover impact.
Yeah, that's a good idea. We haven't yet looked at this, but we have the data for sure. So we know how old on average workers are in a firm, if that's what you mean. But that's a good idea. Yeah. We look at age of firm though, but not at age of the workforce. But there might be that's true. There might be important spillovers that are important heterogeneities.
Simon,
yes.
you showed us, for the mining industry, a significant proportion of workers actually moved out of the district, right? So when you show us this persistent effect on employment, especially those guys outside mining industries, so they are just leaving the area, or they are staying, still searching in the market, local labor market, but still get unemployed. So which case?
Yeah, so I have to admit that I don't know that yet, because we have the individual level data just received right now to look at this, where they actually move. It's probably both of it. At least that's what the data on the firm level suggests. But I have to kind of look into this in more detail, and we now have the individual level data where we can do that. We couldn't do that beforehand, but yeah, there's probably also a lot of movement going on. I'm pretty sure about this. But there seems also to be effects on unemployment, so it's probably both of it. Okay, we also have looked at establishment size, and we see that establishment size declines quite substantially in both the manufacturing and the service sector, partly because establishments become smaller, partly because there's more entry of new, younger establishments. And this is what you see here. So the employment in young firms that are less than 5 years old, and the number of young firms increases substantially, especially of young high-tech firms. And our interpretation of that is that there is like how do you call that? A crowding out effect of these mines, because these are really like big ships, right? They pay high wages to low and medium skilled workers that are way above the average kind of wage for these workers in other regions in Germany. And they sometimes they even finance entire parts of the city. They build houses for those workers and stuff like this, right? And so it's probably very hard for young firms to find a space for entrepreneurship. It's probably relatively difficult for them to hire cheap labor and stuff like this. And what we really see is that we have this positive effect on employment in young firms, number of young firms, and especially on high-tech firms, so to speak. This is essentially I just looked at all industries and classified some of them as high-tech. This is a bit hand-waving, so to speak, but it seems as if there is something going on here. We also looked at employment.
This is super interesting. Sorry, this is super interesting. So, did you check local, say, factor prices, say housing price, rents, wage, something like that? So I can imagine, suppose housing price in Hong Kong is cut by half. There must be a lot of young firms.
We haven't checked that yet, but it's definitely a good idea. I think it's not so easy to get the information, but there must be some information on this. At least it's not so easy to get it on this detailed level. But definitely that's definitely a good idea. We haven't checked that yet. No. And also we see that similar picture in IT, R&D, IT establishments, and so forth. We see kind of this positive effect. So these large tankers appear to have crowded out this more innovative and smaller entrepreneurial kind of thing. What we did then is we wanted to understand how these effects differ by time, because when you just go back, so we have this period here where the subsidies, where the subsidies were super high in the 90s. And the reason behind it was that essentially in the 60s and 50s and in the late 60s, policymakers tried to think about closing the entire mining industry because it became inefficient. But then in response to the two oil shocks, they said, okay, we have to stay independent from foreign energy imports, and we will subsidize this heavily. And this is what they did, especially here between 1985 and 1995. And then they decided to finally close it, but they leave it running out. They said, okay, we have to close all mines eventually. And now in 2019, the last mine closed, and this was already kind of sorted out in the late 90s. So we want to understand whether there's a difference when we look only at mines who really close through a period where there's a lot of subsidizing going on, where everybody essentially expected that this will go on forever, and this is what we looked at for this period, and we really see most of these effects stem from particularly this period. There we have really like the effects on the employment outside mining, specifically towards manufacturing. We see the positive effects for young firms. And if you look on the closures afterwards, who were relatively speaking of similar magnitude, so the mines were not smaller, but of course there were fewer mines overall in Germany in this period, we don't see this effect anymore. I mean, the sign is still the same, but it's essentially not significant and very small. And we have to understand more about this, but what we did so far is we looked at kind of the overall development of the regions that had mines, and we looked at those who had closed their mines before 1985, who had closed their mines throughout this period of high subsidies, so to speak, and who had closed their mines after 1995. And what you see here, that in particular those that had these large negative effects between 1985 and 1994, you see this relative stronger decline in manufacturing relative to those that still have mines for a much longer time. It's understandable that manufacturing doesn't go down that fast, but also relative to those that closed before this period of substantial subsidies. But on the other hand, we see that they actually transited faster towards IT and small firms and stuff. So here it seems that, I mean, there was not really IT in the 80s, right? But then when it paced, when the IT sector took pace, it was actually the places that were hit hardest, that had the highest growth in these innovative industries, even relative to those who did close before the period of subsidizing. And also when we see this with respect to the younger firms, we see a similar picture. We don't really see it for patent applications. One reason might be that, so if you look at patents in Germany, most German patents come out of manufacturing, especially car manufacturing, actually. We should compare that to the US, for instance, where most patents come rather out of IT. So I think in Germany, there's very few patents coming out of IT and those things. So we don't see that here. But if we look kind of only patents that are really outside the mining industry, we see, I mean, it's very noisy, but we see a bit of higher patents also for these regions that suffered actually most, right? From this mine closures. But it's jumping around quite a bit, and we have to dig deeper into this to better understand this. I mean, there's what types of patents these actually are. But when you then look at unemployment, you see kind of they do not really profit that much from it, right? In terms of unemployment, at least. They have higher unemployment, nevertheless. And if you also look at employment, you see that the employment declines or the grows much slower than in the region that had mines after 1995, and also then in the regions that closed their mines before the period of these large and strong subsidies. But
so Simon, I have a question. Yeah. So the exit of this mine company seems to have two potential effects that leads to entry. One is that, as you talked about earlier, that they kind of lower the barriers to entry, but the other possibility is is that the change in environmental factors and therefore amenity improve. So, and that make the location become more attractive than before. So how can you kind of separate these two?
That's a good point, but so far I don't know. So we would have to look more on amenities. We didn't do that so far, but this is definitely an issue we should think about more. And if you have a suggestion, I would.
Right. I guess Michael's suggestion looking at the prices may help, right? Because if this amenity improve, then people, even the house price, even the real estate doesn't go down, but amenity improve, they will still go there. But if it's not amenity, then it has to be the lower cost.
Yeah, we should definitely check that. And also the as far as I understand, the mining industry subsidized quite heavily the housing for miners, essentially.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So this when they are gone, that probably went away and
right.
gave leeway for these other industries for sure. So concluding remarks, I don't know whether I still have quite some time left actually.
Yeah, you have 20 minutes or so.
Still 30 minutes. I was pretty fast then. when I practiced it took much longer. Anyways, so then I still conclude. So we see that these mine closures create substantial negative employment spillovers, specifically into manufacturing, construction, service, and this suggests that the mining industry kind of a regional anchor, and there's some evidence of these co-agglomeration economies or local multiplier effects. But then on the other side, we kind of see the strong crowding out with respect to kind of more like smaller firms, more innovative firms, or more knowledge-based growth. And the interesting thing is that this seems to come from the regions that were hit hardest by the agglomeration effects, that suffered most from the downside of these mine closures, whereas we find less of such an effect for regions that either did not suffer as much from the closures because they still have the mines, or they closed them throughout a period where the mining sector was not at all that subsidized. So so far we don't really, I have to admit, we don't really understand why this is happening, and we have to dig deeper into it. But so far that's, I think, what it is.
Thanks a lot, Simon. We have a lot of time for discussion, but let me ask the first question. So I'm quite interested in this heterogeneous effects. Can you go back to, basically you see a big difference between those closed before and after, 1995. So can you say a bit more about why this is the case? And it seems that you are suggesting if you started this kind of policies to subsidize these plants, then the structural transformation will be kind of slowed down. And there is a kind of negative side of this thing, right? Can you elaborate a bit more on this? You need to unmute yourself, Sam.
Sorry. Yeah, that's actually so far our guess, but we don't know quite yet what's really. So what we know is, if you look on the relative impact of the closure, there's not much difference. So essentially, if you look at where is it? If you look at this picture before and after 1995, the relative impact on the average region is very similar. Nevertheless, there seems not to be such a local spillover effect. I mean, there's probably a couple of reasons for that. One is that, I mean, that because times have changed, technology has advanced, that these old industries that heavily relied on the coal were not there anymore. That would be a simple suggestion. But then when we look at these regions that still have mining, they also still have iron metal. They also still have manufacturing. So we don't think that it will be only this. The other thing is that that there was much less subsidies in this, and that this has something to do with it. But we honestly we don't understand it yet that good. But that's just what we see. That it's like that entire effect essentially comes from the period between 1985 and 1995. Might also be that people have learned from that, right? That they say, okay, we have to find a way out of this. But we don't know it yet. We have to dig deeper into that.
Did you look at for example, I know that this is a big of geography from the south to north, but suppose if you control for that, and you're looking at which one is more likely to be closed, and I could be that the ones that the economy is actually the surrounding areas is booming, and then the mind the negative effects or the environmental effects, it could be more important. This is more higher population density and so on, and therefore they're more likely to move that up, close that one. And now, but because of that, so then that the earlier ones tends to be maybe located closer to more densely populated areas, and therefore they may have more entry and more growth because of precondition.
Yeah, I mean, that might be part of the story, although I think that there's two things. One is that really in the south it was kind of exhausted. They just could not mine anymore, so they had to kind of close those first. Plus the RAG itself, so the companies running those mines, they were not entirely interested in local spillover effects too much. They were really like more interested in saving money, so to speak. And I don't know how much they kind of tried to mingle with that to kind of say, okay, we go first, close the mines first, where we don't think it has such a negative effect.
Or you think about, for example, you mentioned that they subsidize the housing and so on, right? So if, with the high, more densely populated areas, that cost is much higher for subsidizing. But mine, and so therefore they're more likely to go first.
That's true. On the other hand, the entire region is pretty densely populated. So actually the rural area is the most densely populated area in entire Europe, with people per square meter. So there might still be differences, and what's for sure might play a role that, and we probably will only be able to figure that out when we have the mobility data that you have here. So Cologne and these successful cities are here in the south, right? So there might be a lot of movement going out of these places towards Cologne and these regions that are more successful. We don't know that yet, but this might also be one explanation of that. But if you look at those cities like Bochum, Essen and stuff like this, they're very close together. So if you're there, then it's essentially, it's like one city, that's one train station to the next, basically, and it's very densely populated.
Simon, can I ask you whether German data allows one to track like a family relationship across different cohorts of workers? In particular, is there a way to find out what children of the coal miners do? Like, is it like, given that the demise of coal mining in a way is fully predictable given the gap between international and domestic prices, right? So you can imagine like a very different kind of scenarios, which would be interesting to figure out in the data. One would be, what the Hilberry Elegy kind of a book that says some industry disappears, children of those workers in the US somehow just getting to desperate, their entire life get destroyed, versus perhaps in Germany, maybe maybe the coal mining families, the kitchen table discussion will be, the parents' work is just not the career for your children. You need to study harder. You need to look for other other jobs when you grow up, and therefore they do something differently in high school or colleges than their counterparts otherwise would do, and therefore one of your there could be underlines one of your finding that maybe the local IT industry boom or other industry boom come from the fact that the children of the coal mine workers try harder to find a job elsewhere. Whichever is the right hypothesis, I think will be very interesting.
Yeah, that you're absolutely right. That would be very, very interesting. But unfortunately, in this register data, we cannot really link that. So we could try to, because most of the miners have migration background, right? It's a really large population. We could try to look at young people with different migration background, but then it will also be difficult because many will have citizenship, and we probably will not be able to detect this anymore. But that, that would be really great if we could do this. I'm thinking about whether there's other data like survey data that allows us to do such a thing. Maybe it's a socioeconomic panel. If that has enough observations, we would have to check this, but that's really, really great idea. But with the data that we have at the moment, we cannot see who is the children of whom, unfortunately.
Simon, I'm thinking about like what really is the stress point. When intuitively, when I think about the subsidies, it can come in two ways. One is that it helps orderly adjustment. The other one is that it is detrimental to adjustment. So the way I think about it is that maybe if you can look at the mine workers that are let go and look at the age profile, given all that you have, you would expect that you would want that the released workers, the younger ones and better educated, while the older ones, you keep the older ones that have less career alternatives. So is it possible to look at it? Because clearly there are all the environmental factors, the economic climate and all this thing. But maybe you can pinpoint on whether the subsidy is helping or hurting orderly adjustment. And looking at the age profile of the let go workers may be a way to start that process.
Yeah, that's indeed a good idea, and we can do that. So we can look on the age structure of the worker, and we can look also at individual workers. And what we already figured out that there was, which is kind of nuts, that they still had apprenticeship training in the very last year. So even the mine that closed in 2019, where there was no mine left afterwards, they trained apprentices still until the end, even though they will not have a job afterwards. And this might be kind of an anchor to look at these younger and older workers and how they do. And this is indeed a good idea, and we can do that, yeah.
Great. If there's no further question, let's end this presentation. And actually, I have a question for the organizers. Actually, may I suggest we start a bit earlier, the last session, just to make the life a bit easier for those of you on the other side of the planet. Can we actually come back in, say, 10 minutes and start the last presentation at 10:50? Is it okay?
Probably not. I think, because we have people flow from one session to another session.
Okay, fine. Okay, it's okay. Let's stay with the original plan. All right, then let's come back at 11.
Okay.
Thanks a lot, Simon.
Thank you for your comments and discussion. Very helpful. Thanks a lot.
Simon, so just we have some time. I just want to ask you. So you have looked at the university. So you mentioned Ehsan, right? So Ehsan was a coal mining place, but I think it's kind of had a rebirth in recent. I don't know when did the rebirth start, but Ehsan seems to be doing quite well now, right? A lot of it, I guess, is related to the university and some new. So you must have looked at university kind of presence in the region and the other diversity of employment share besides coal mining. And so on. So do you find any interesting patterns about whether the coal mine closure might, result in positive versus negative outcomes as depending on what is the other things that going on in the region?
Yeah. Actually, so we have this university data and we know when they were established. And so far what we have done is we looked at kind of the relationship between patenting and mine closures. And there, what we kind of see is that if these mines close, there's a particular decline in patents because these mines were pretty innovative. So they did a lot of patents for chemicals, explosives, and stuff like this. But on average, this effect vanishes if there was a university before. So they seem to take over the patent and activities, especially if it was universities of applied science and not humanistic universities. That's one result that we have there, and it's indeed true. That explains the Ehsan situation. Ehsan is actually quite interesting because Ehsan has a part which is very successful and rich, and the part is very poor. And essentially, the part that's very poor is where the coal mining has been taking place before, whereas and it's really divided by a highway. Essentially, it's really like there's one part very poor and one part very rich, and the one part that is closer to university is the one that's richer.
And what about employment, like pre-closure employment diversity in terms of industrial, sector, industries, and so on? Does if a town is, a lot of the U.S. kind of coal mining towns got decimated if the coal mine were to be closed because there's no other thing to do, right? So, but if Germany seems to be quite different because mines seem to be rather not in the mountains, far away in a remote area, seem to be in quite a populated area. At least I wouldn't have thought Ehsan was a big mining place when I first arrived, visited for the first time. Actually, I went to Ehsan twice. I once even went to a place where the previous coal mining. I don't know what they do, but there are big shops still being left as museums for people.
Yeah, there's big museum there.
Yeah. So I thought it was but I was thinking that might be that Ehsan also has other kind of industries around, right? So that gives Ehsan more resilience when the coal mine closes. I know still there's some part of the town that's kind of poor, run down, but in general it has more resilience if there are other things going on.
Yeah, that's definitely true, and we have to dig deeper into that, and that might be one of the explanations for like also the differences why some do not suffer as much as others. I mean, there's not really an area that is comparable to the US. None of these mining regions like a desert or a mountain area. They are all pretty densely populated, but there's areas that are have been always very, very blue collar, and there's areas where there was more white collar even before, and probably more innovation before. And we have to look at this more closely. I mean, the interesting thing is that those far in the north, they're actually the typical blue collar areas, and there are still mines, and these regions do quite well. But in the middle, there where the hardest effects, that's a mixed thing, so to speak. But it's true that in the south, these are areas like Bonn is there, I guess, and these are more like the government has been there and stuff like this, right? And this is one thing that we have to exploit in more detail there.
So let me ask a follow-up question on Bernard's suggestion. He's not there, unfortunately, but I found his idea is fascinating. So this is also related to a kind of long-standing issue in China. So how do we deal with those dying SOEs? So the idea in China is, you know, we really need to protect these firms, those zombie firms, and we have to take care of you know, the laid off workers if, you know, those firms were closed. But, you know, you are suggesting a kind of a quite different picture, especially you think about the establishment of those young firms, those R&D firms, right? So one possibility, as Bernard suggested, is, you know, those old workers, they just choose to leave the market. And those young workers, they just start up their own businesses. But the problem, the next question is how successful they are, those young laid off workers. So their first job is in the mining industry, and then they were forced to leave. So so if there is any negative selection there, then their future business probably will be less successful than those, you know, who pick up, you know, this thing at the first stage. So I think this is something we really want to know. If, you know, they start up their businesses and 5 years later, 3 years later, most of them just gone, then, you know, we just leave the problem to the future. We didn't really solve the problem, right?
Yeah, that might be very well the case, because if you look at the educational structure of these miners, it's like, I think 30% have no real formal education. And that's very high in comparison. I think there's less than 4% in Germany on average that have no formal education. So this is like a very negatively selected population, despite all the, there's a lot of engineers, right? Because nowadays there's a lot of technology in there too. But those might be able to successfully start their own business. But I could imagine that many of these low-skilled workers face huge problems. And this would also explain why, despite the fact that there are so many young firms and despite the fact there's more IT and stuff, that there's still higher unemployment and lower employment growth. So we don't know what type of IT firms those are, but I mean, they might kind of whatever, right? That might be very low tier IT firms.
Yeah, one thing that I think you can do it with your data is to look at first, you know, exit rate, and then just keep track of say size distribution of those startups, and see if in the end the size distribution is comparable to those, you know, in other regions. The idea is suppose, you know, you see high exit rate and the size distribution is actually much less dispersed than size distribution in other regions, and then that's an indication for, you know, low success rate, because those startups in the end cannot grow actually into industrial giants. So that's too easy way to. I believe there are many better ways to check that, but that's sort of the first cut.
I mean, we did a bit on this, so, and it seems really that on average the firm size is going down quite a bit in those regions, and this suggests kind of would be in line with your idea, I guess.
Right.
And it's both actually. You have like these large firms become smaller, but also that these small firms enter. But what we did not yet do is we did not yet look at how long they live, so to speak. That's a good idea. Yeah.